I no longer think about God as a personality. All our talk about God can only be symbolic, because what we mean by God is absolutely beyond words and ideas and speech. And I think the image of God as a personality, as a father, as a creator is a very good one. But if it stops there, it can become an idol, and it can be abused, because you can start thinking God is just like me, and God has all my likes and dislikes and my prejudices, and he's only on my side in a war. So I think that the way to deal with suffering is to try to use it creatively. When one has suffered pain oneself, I think it gives you an entree into the pain of other people. You can use it not just to sort of stop it, but as a sort of springboard to action. Recently, I've been involved with a wonderful group called the Bereaved Families Circle in Palestine, Israel. And here, a group of people who have all lost children in the Arab-Israeli conflict, Palestinian and Israeli, have come together to say we don't want anybody else to suffer this pain as we have. And so they're now all working together for peace. And I think that's a wonderful example to us all, to use your pain not as an excuse to reach out and hurt other people, thinking you've now got a license to inflict pain because you have suffered and you are a victim, but to use it to make peace and to reach out to the other. Because the one thing that we all have in life, as the Buddhists tell us, is pain. It's the one thing that all human beings share. Even the most fortunate of us will suffer at some point of our lives. We have to die for one thing. And so that is the thing that can unite us, is an appreciation of our own pain first. Because if we deny our own pain, it's important to feel it fully and take ownership of it. Because if we deny it, we're likely to dismiss the pain of other people too. I found in my studies that every single one of what we call the major world religions has at its core an ethic of compassion, which doesn't mean feeling sorry for people or feeling pity or being merciful. It means putting yourself in the position of somebody else. And it's summed up in the golden rule: always treat all others as you would wish to be treated yourself. And the religions have all, in their different ways, said that that is the test of true spirituality. It's not that these religions are all the same. They're not. But they all agree that there's something wrong with your spirituality, with your religiosity, if it makes you unkind, intolerant of others, cruel. And so I was surprised about this because I hadn't experienced religion as a particularly compassionate force in my own life. It's obvious why, especially in the light of recent events, people have this idea of religion as inherently violent. But it has got this ethic. And instead of, when you see religious people coming together, they never speak about compassion. They're always talking about dogma or abstruse doctrine or a sexual ethic or a political angle. And what the world needs now is compassion, putting yourself in other people's shoes. It's now an urgent imperative, not just a nice thing to do, that we make sure that all peoples whoever they are treated as we would wish to be treated ourselves. And that in the negative version of the Golden Rule, we never treat other people as we would not like to be treated ourselves. And unless we do this, I think with the world as it is, and with the availability of hideous weapons, the world is not going to be a viable place. People sometimes say to me, well, you're just preaching to the converted. You're preaching, as the Americans say, very often, to the choir. That is, you're speaking to the choir who have to be in church anyway, and you're not making an impact. You need to speak to the terrorists, they say. I say that, look, I am quite happy to sing to the choir because the choir isn't singing. If all the people who really believe in the Golden Rule, and people always say, oh, I believe in the Golden Rule, I don't care whether they believe in it or not, they've got to do something about it and find ways. It's our duty, all of us, in whatever sphere of life we're in, to find practical and creative and realistic ways of making that compassionate ethos a dynamic, a powerful dynamic. Then the silent majority, who is in favour of compassion and the Golden Rule, will become active, and the extremist minority will be overcome. So I think it's a major task for our time. Empires have been colonizing and forcing their rule on people since centuries before Christ, before the Common Era. And the empire is a very violent institution. It exists for war and plunder and conquest. Instead of looking with respect at the people whose land you are taking over, you're just extracting resources, people, even slaves, and the rule of the empire is always hated. And what has happened in the modern period is that the empire now has the power to strike back, because in the old days, weaponry was only for the rich and the few. When people came at us British, we had more powerful weapons and could mow them down, and we did mow them down. But now we see with the suicide bomber, 9/11, we see that people can fight back. I think the Dalai Lama is always saying this, that it's not in our interests anymore to be violent in this way because it will come back to us. And I think it's terribly important that we all look at our colonial pasts and that we listen very hard to the voices of the colonized people and not just wipe them aside in contempt and say, oh, well, it's all a long time ago, because these hurts and these dislocations in societies run very deep. And sometimes when you watch politicians arguing in our parliaments or a television panel, when one person is speaking, you can see that the others are not really listening to what he is saying. They're either, they're just thinking of the next brilliant remark that they're going to make, or finding out how they can twist her words in order to make a telling point. This isn't listening. And when we listen, we have to listen to the underlying pain. It's, we often interrupt when people are telling their stories, say when a Palestinian is telling her story. And they say, no, it didn't happen like that, actually. That's not the point. We all know in our own lives, when we tell stories ourselves, we emphasize some things because that reflects an inner reality, the reality of the pain that has been suffered. And so that and any psychiatrist will tell you that a narrative is not necessarily about facts, but it's about inner realities which are just as real and just as important and just as much impact on the world. So now we have to really listen, learn to empty ourselves, listen. We need leaders now who will listen. In the pre-modern world, it was widely accepted everywhere that there were two ways of encountering reality. One was by logos. That's reason, thinking, which enables us to sort of plan things, and it has to fit. Logos has to be fit exactly to external reality. Otherwise, our plans come to naught. If I decide I want to fly home, like a mythical being, it's not going to work. I have to take external reality into account. From logos comes our science, which is a wonderful tool for discovering the world and has created great benefits, including modern medicine, for example, it's been of great benefit. But in the West, we've rather concentrated on logos since about the 16th century and degraded myth. Now, in popular speech, myth is often just taken to be untruth. A politician, if he's accused of a sin in his past life, is likely to say, oh, it's just a myth. In other words, it didn't happen. But in the pre-modern world, people knew that a mythical story was nothing to do with history. It was more than history. It was telling you the meaning of what happened, the inner meaning of what happened. Furthermore, it was a timeless truth. It wasn't just one occurrence that happened once. It happened all the time. There's a very good definition of myth, that it's something that in some sense happened once, but which also happens all the time. The very important thing to learn about myth is that it makes no sense unless it's put into action. It's a program for action. Myth places you in the correct spiritual posture, but it's up to you to take the next step. And in the old days, myths were ritualized. They were acted out in magnificent rituals, which like a theatrical performance or a great movie made it real to you. And when you acted it out, you realized the truth of what that myth was in your reality. A myth was usually imparted to people, often in the course of a program for change, initiation. The myths of the tribe would be passed to young men when they were undergoing these horrific ordeals that were making them overnight into grown men, making these young, callow boys into fighters for the tribe and hunters. They didn't have time to have an adolescence to find themselves and go to university and be students. The tribe needed them now. So they were put through these tremendous ordeals, and the myths were imparted to them in that setting. And the point about a myth is you will not understand it if you're not prepared to be changed by it. If you just laugh at it or try to probe it with logos, it'll close up like a clam. And later, in the axial age, I'll explain that in a moment, these myths were enacted in an ethical way, or in a spiritual, meditative way. And then it became real. The axial age was a period from about 900 to 200 BCE, when all the great world religions that nourish many, many people on the globe today came into being during this period in 4 distinct parts of the world. In China, where you have Confucius and Laozi, Taoism. in India, where you have Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, monotheism in the Middle East, and philosophical rationalism in Europe, in Greece. And we keep coming back to these. Those people, those sages, people like Socrates, the prophets of Israel, the Buddha, Confucius, the sages of the Upanishads, they were sort of spiritual giants, and they worked as hard to find a solution to the problems of their time as we do today when we're trying to find a cure for cancer. They took the religions that they'd inherited and changed them drastically to meet their time. And an important thing to remember is that these sages weren't just sitting in peaceful hermitages, meditating. They were all of them living in societies where violence had reached an unprecedented crescendo. Of course, the violence is pitiful with compared with what we face today, but it was still horrific to the people of the time. Empires were coming, for example, force, armies, powerful states. And these sages developed the compassionate ethos to counter it. And I found it was interesting that in every case of each one of these traditions, the catalyst for major religious change was a revulsion from violence, was a disciplined turning away from violence. And then, now what on earth do we do about it? And so they took the myths and so when you look at the myth of the Trinity, for example, which has caused great problems to many Christians, it was devised by the Greeks, not as a sort of conundrum or a riddle, 3 in 1 and 1 in 3, and you were supposed to believe this thing. It was a meditation. It was a meditation, a bit like the Buddhist mandala, where you circle round the 3 manifestations of God that Christians saw, and then up to the God that you could never describe, and back again, circling in this way. And unless you've done the meditation, you don't get Trinity. It's like those sort of mathematical problems we did at school to chase a whole line of reasoning through and then ended up, so x equals 2y squared. Now that x equals, that means nothing unless you've gone through the process. So, but we've lost that. Because of our logos-driven minds in the modern world, we've lost that capacity. So we think, well, the Trinity is just nonsense, and if you don't do the meditation, you don't get it. And religion is really, and has always been, until in the West in the 16th century, it became something different. It's always been a practical skill, like driving or swimming. You can't learn to drive a car simply by reading the car manual or studying the rules of the road. You've got to get into the car and manipulate the brakes and everything. Dancing, you've got to practice for years before you, and have talent, but work for years, every day, all day, every day. And people have found that by putting these myths into practice, they achieve in spiritual terms, the same unearthly grace as a dancer who performs feats that are absolutely impossible for the untrained body. But if you don't do the myths, you don't get what they mean, and they just become nonsense. And that's made religion very, very difficult for a lot of people today. Fundamentalism it's not a very satisfactory term. It was a term coined by American Protestants at the turn of the 20th century to describe their particular reform movement, and it doesn't fit other traditions at all, and they rather resent having this Christian term foisted upon them. But it represents a widespread dissatisfaction with modernity. In every region where a modern secular-style society has been set up that separates religion and politics as a matter of principle, there's been a countercultural protest. People want to see religion reflected more clearly in public life. And this is a very new thing, this separation of religion and politics comes in the West in the about 17th, 18th centuries. And so it's foisted on other peoples who haven't been through that Western process. And it seems nonsense to them. And so the fundamentalists, whether they have sprung up in every major world faiths. So you have fundamentalists, Buddhists, fundamentalist Hindus, Sikhs, fundamentalist Jews, Christians, and Muslims. They're not necessarily violent. Most are simply trying to live what they regard as a good religious life in a world that seems hostile to faith. And their 4 Fs have been raged because they feel under attack. Every fundamentalist movement that I've studied in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is rooted in a profound fear of annihilation. Everyone is convinced that modern secular society wants to wipe them out. And that's not a myth in the bad sense. That's not paranoia. If you think that Jewish fundamentalism took 1 or 2 steps forward, and one was after the Nazi Holocaust, when Hitler had been trying to exterminate Western Jewry, and the second was after the 1973 war, when Israel had a real shock with the Arab invasion. Now, we often think that fundamentalism is just Islamic. That it goes together in that way, that song like love and marriage or a horse and carriage. Absolutely not. In fact, of the 3 monotheistic religions, Islam was the last to develop a true fundamentalist wing after the disaster of the 6-day war between Israel and Palestine, when the secularist Western ideologies such as nationalism or socialism, which we colonialists had imported to these regions, they had no grassroots support, and they felt that the people had been let down. And Muslim fundamentalism developed very much as this countercultural protest, because the reformers in the Muslim world who had to reform quickly, they didn't have the 200 or 300 years that we had in Europe to develop our modern secular institutions. They had to modernize yesterday. And they wanted their countries to look modern, even if half the population hadn't a clue what was going on, hadn't had a Western education, couldn't understand. The Shahs used to make their soldiers go out in Iran with their bayonets out, taking off the women's veils and ripping them to pieces in front of them. Now, in such circumstances, secularism doesn't seem a nice liberal, freeing thing. It is literally lethal. And some of the most extreme forms of Sunni fundamentalism developed in the concentration camps into which President Nasser, in the 1950s, interred thousands of members of the Muslim Brotherhood who were greatly threatening his regime. They had great popularity and were providing the people with basic utilities like schools and factories and healthcare that the government couldn't give them. They threw them in jail without trial, often for doing little more than handing out leaflets or attending a meeting. And there they were interred for 15 years in hideous conditions. They were tortured, suffered prison diseases, and executed. And one of them was Sayyid Qutb, who entered the camp as a moderate liberal and became a fundamentalist in the jail when he heard Nasser vowing to secularize Egypt on the Western model and looked round at this hideous concentration camp. He wanted to go back to Islam. So fundamentalism is difficult because people feel under threat. Very often, they distort the tradition they're trying to protect.
أما الرسول فأنبتناه به فذلك جاء الكامل تلك آيات الله الكتاب المبين أنزلنا قرآنا عربيا لعلكم تعقلون نقص عليك وقصص أوحينا إليك هذا القرآن إن كنتم من قبله لمن الغافلين إذ قال يوسف لأبيه يا أبت إني أخشى.
I was on the high-level group of the Alliance of Civilizations in the United Nations, which was set up some years back to sort of try and bring an alliance of civilizations, not a clash of civilizations. And we were asked, this group, to diagnose the causes of extremism. And in our report, which we presented, I think, in 2006 to Kofi Annan, we said that unless there was an equitable solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict, there would be no peace, that all the other things that we recommended about, say, immigration laws or education or youth programs, employment programs, none of that would have any effect at all, because this has become symbolic. It's become symbolic, mythical, if you like. It expresses a mythical reality of imbalance. To the Jewish people, it represents their survival after the hell of Auschwitz. It's, as it were, the Jewish state arises out of the ashes of the concentration camps. And they identify with it very strongly, can do, and because of that hideous experience, their threat mechanism is raged, and any attack to Israel seems about to start another Holocaust. On the other hand, the Palestinians have become their alter egos. They have now lost their land, as the Jews lost their land. They are occupied. This occupation has gone on even despite United Nations resolutions, and they endure oppression, and their position is tragic. And when Muslims all around the world see what's happened to the Palestinians, this has become symbolic of everything that's happened to the Muslim world in the modern period. This humiliation, this impotence, the fact that 750 Palestinians could be unseated from their homes and the world did nothing. This has become symbolic, and it festers in people's minds and hearts. Osama bin Laden always mentions Palestine, Israel, or he did when he was alive, because he knew his audience, and he knew that is something very deep. So we must find a solution, and it doesn't help when you have, as it were, neo-colonial imperialist powers wading in. We must help these people to make peace with each other. One of the things we recommended was a white paper, not yet another of those literally leaflets, but the people went round documenting people's personal histories, memories of what happened, and so that we had the complete picture, not just the ones given by the various states or leaders. But we must work for the solution to this tragic problem, or we have no hope for our future.
المبين